Hi everyone, my name is Tom Pettit and welcome back to this week's episode of Beyond Come Follow Me. This week in your Come Follow Me lesson, you are studying the doctrine that is found in just section 124. But it's not just one section, it's a really long section. And there's two things in there that the Lord's going to be talking about, the Nauvoo House and the Temple. And I'm going to explain briefly just some of the history behind the Nauvoo House and what it was and what it is today. And then I'm just going to tell you a bunch of stories about people who were in Nauvoo at the time that the Nauvoo Temple was being constructed and share with you some of their stories and some of their experiences of working on the temple and dedicating their lives and their talents towards the building of the temple. But as far as the history of section 124 goes, we've got to go all the way back to 1823. That's when Moroni first appeared to Joseph Smith, and he visited Joseph 3 times in the night and 1 time the following day. Among other things, telling Joseph about a record that was hidden in a nearby hill, whereupon was engraven on plates the gospel of Jesus Christ as delivered by him to the ancient inhabitants of this continent, and among other things. And among those other things, Moroni talked a lot about the temple. And if you go back and look at the words of Moroni and the scriptures he was quoting, it's very clear and obvious that Moroni spent a lot of that evening with Joseph talking about the temple. Well, things start to happen with the restoration, and we get the Book of Mormon translation underway and then published. We got the church officially organized on April 6th, 1830. Joseph, in the meantime, had moved to Susquehanna or Harmony, Pennsylvania, then up to Fayette, where he was told in a commandment, in a revelation, go to the Ohio, and there I will give unto you my law and endow you with power from on high. Again, more talk about the temple. So he'd get to Kirtland, be commanded to build the temple and perform ordinances there in the temple. I've spent a lot of these videos in the past talking about everything in great detail that I've talked to about up to this point, but then also again in great detail about the building of the Kirtland Temple and the dedication of the Kirtland Temple. But the saints had to leave Kirtland and leave the Nauvoo Temple behind. They'd go to Far West. They would dedicate cornerstones in hopes of building a temple in Far West, but the enemies of the church would drive them out of Missouri, and now they find themselves in Nauvoo, again with another commandment to build the temple. Now, they were without the Kirtland Temple, or had to leave the Kirtland Temple. They had hopes of a temple in Jackson County, which never came about. They had hopes of a temple in Far West that never came about, and here they are again without a temple. Perhaps we can liken ourselves to these early saints. For when COVID came around and shut down the temples, just before COVID shut down our temples, or was the reason for the temples being shut down, a lot of us who were going to the temple, we didn't know it was the last time in a long time that we were going. When we left the temple for the last time before COVID hit, and then we were told we can't go back for a while, we didn't know how long that would be. And now as the temple doors are starting to reopen and we're able to get back into the temple and go through those ordinances once again after such a lengthy break, perhaps we can sense a little bit of what those early saints were feeling on the inside, leaving a temple, not knowing when they're going to get back inside one. And so we might be able to understand a little bit of their anxiety and their hope for a new temple here now in Nauvoo. And when section 124 came, commanding not only Joseph but all the saints to now build another temple, boy, what hope that would have given them, and how much happiness and joy it must have provided. And that's evident in the dedication that the individuals gave toward the construction of the temple. And not only during the construction, but after the temple was dedicated and now available for ordinances for the living and for the dead, then their anxiety even grew more. All these stories of building the temple and working inside the temple after the dedication, I'm going to tell you a bunch of those stories. But let's get into and they're coming in this video, but let's get into this section just a little bit. In section 124, it talks of the Lord's going to be talking about those two places, the Nauvoo House and the Nauvoo Temple. And before I get into that, I see a note I've made that I want to tell you of something that's coming at the end of this video. You'll see in your Come Follow Me lessons that there's some talk, some quotes, some history about the organization of the Relief Society, which was organized for the first time in Nauvoo. And so I'll let you read those quotes and that history on your own. But to kind of supplement that, what I've done at the end of this video is I've got a little video tour of a place in Nauvoo that's dedicated to women. And so it's called the Women's Garden there in Nauvoo. And so I just take you on a little brief video tour of it. You can see those statues and the gardens there in Nauvoo and what that looks like today. And that's coming at the tail end of the video. All right, so we're in section 124, and the Lord starts talking about this house. And it's not the temple, but it would become known as the Nauvoo House. And the Lord explains exactly what he wants that house to be. Essentially, it's going to be like a hotel where visitors to Nauvoo can come and have a place to stay while they mingle with the saints, they do business with the saints, they learn about the church. And so they're commanded to build this hotel type of building. Now that building still exists today. Although it wasn't completed in Joseph's lifetime, it's still there. And now I've got a picture of it here behind me. And the church that owns it, it's not our church, but it's the Community of Christ owns the Nauvoo House. And that's the new-ish name for what was once known as the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the two entities being the same, but going by the name of Community of Christ. Now, and they own the Nauvoo House, and you can rent the house. It's set up, the interior today is kind of like a dormitory, where they've got a bunch of bunk beds and things, so you can rent it out and utilize it for youth conferences or big family reunions or things like that. But here in the 1840s, when the Lord's talking about the Nauvoo House and the original purpose of it, starting in verse 23 and in down through 24, he talks about the qualities that he wants in this home. And as you know, I think that we look at the instruction or counsel from Nephi where he says you ought to liken the scriptures to yourself. And as you know, as I've regularly relate to you, I think we should relate church history to ourselves as well, because of all the wonderful lessons that we learn in church history and how relevant it is in our day today. And so I would suggest that in verse 23 and 24, when the Lord is talking about the qualities that he wants in the Nauvoo House, that we can take those same qualities and say, well, that's what we should strive to have in our own homes, in our own houses today. Take a look. And it shall be a house for boarding, a house that strangers may come from afar to lodge therein. That's not the part we should liken to ourselves. I don't know if we should rent out rooms to strangers, but here it comes now. Let it be a good house, worthy of all acceptance, that the weary traveler might find health and safety while he shall contemplate the word of the Lord. Now there's some good qualities to have in our own homes. Health, safety, a good house where we can contemplate the word of the Lord. You know, that home-centered, church-supported idea that President Nelson has been teaching us and asking us to do. And it continues on, 24. This house shall be a healthful habitation, if it be built unto my name, and if the governor which shall be appointed unto it shall not suffer any pollution. Here's another quality: not suffer any pollution to come upon it. And then the promise, it shall be holy. So if we want our houses to be holy, our homes to be holy, a place where we can feel the Spirit, here's the ingredients. Make it healthy and safe. Now, healthy, yeah, we should be healthy. You know, we should wash our hands and wash our clothes and bathe occasionally, you know. But maybe it's more than just the physical health that we should be concerned about with our homes. What about a place where we can have refuge from the world, where we can find good emotional health? How about good spiritual health? Good mental health can be fostered in the home. Perhaps we can liken it that way when we look at that word health. And then safety, a refuge from the storm. Again, mental, physical, emotional, spiritual safety should be fostered in our home, a place where we and anybody who comes into a home can rely on those sorts of safeties. And then it continues on, the Lord saying, and don't suffer any pollution to come into it. Yeah, it's a good idea not to have somebody smoke in your house or to let the bad air come in or garbage pile up in the living room. Yeah, that's a good thing to remember. But what other sort of pollutions do you think we should keep out of our homes? Anything that comes through the phones, the computers, the TVs, the radios, or anybody who comes in that doesn't treat our house as a place that's to be holy. Well, if we follow that counsel from the Lord promises it shall be holy. Our homes can be holy. Let's continue on now down into verse 27. And now the Lord's going to start talking about the actual temple. And he says, and build a house unto my name for the Most High to dwell therein. In 28, for there is not a place found on the earth where he may come to and restore again that which was lost unto you. So restore what was lost, restore it to you so you can have it. And we don't have a temple. The Kirtland Temple, it still stands, but it's not being used for the purpose. And from Nauvoo to Kirtland is like 900 miles. And so it's not available to the saints. So there's no place on earth where he can come and dwell. So we need to build a temple. And then he gives a little bit of an inkling of what's to come. We're not just going to build another temple, but we're going to build a temple now where he can come and restore again that which was lost. So we've had restorations of things going on all the way up to the Nauvoo period. So what's the Lord talking about? Well, we have to understand what the Kirtland Temple was for. Of all the things the Kirtland Temple was for, in addition to temple ordinances, the only temple ordinances that took place in the Kirtland Temple is what those early saints referred to as an endowment, but today we would refer to as initiatory. And it was only provided to the living, no proxy work. There's no baptismal font in the Kirtland Temple. And so now the Lord's revealing, now that in this temple, in the Nauvoo Temple, I'm going to restore more. And it's in Nauvoo where the Lord restores all the temple ordinances, not only for the living, but now for the dead as well. And so what we recognize, what we experience in our temples today, the saints experienced in Nauvoo, the same thing. And so here it's being restored. What was lost is now going to be restored again. And then it continues on in verse 28, or which he hath taken away, even the fullness of the priesthood. And then the Lord starts stepping in right away with baptisms. For a baptism of font, there's not upon the earth in which we can do baptisms for the dead, that they, my saints, may be baptized for those who are dead. For this ordinance belongeth to my house, and cannot be acceptable to me only in the days of your poverty, wherein ye are not able to build a house unto me. So in order to do baptisms for the dead, the Lord's teaching, it's got to be done in the temple. But when you don't have a temple, there are circumstances when I can authorize that work to be done outside the temple. And the Lord would authorize that. The first baptisms for the dead in this dispensation would take place in the Mississippi River. I don't want to spoil too much of the story, because in section 127, either next week or the week after that, we talk about baptisms for the dead. And I'll tell you all that history and stories of how the saints found out, how it was taught by Joseph, and some of the experiences of baptizing for our ancestors in the Mississippi River. But then he continues on, and so that's coming. And then he continues on in verse 30, for this ordinance, which talks about the baptisms, belongeth to my house. Oh, I already read that. And verse 31, but I command you, all ye my saints, to build a house, meaning the temple. And in 32, but behold, at the end of this appointment, your baptisms for the dead shall not be acceptable unto me. Now, I wanted to just make mention of that and the foreshadowing of the stories of the Mississippi River, because when you read that, on the surface it says, your baptisms aren't going to be acceptable unto me. Now, that's a problem. It's because when the temple is built, when the temple is dedicated, and there's a place to do baptisms for the dead inside the temple, then the baptisms that are taking place in the Mississippi River and wherever else, those are no longer acceptable. That's just a temporary solution to the temporary problem that we have of not having a dedicated font inside a temple. So he says, after the temple is built, we're going to do away with this Mississippi River stuff, and we're just going to be inside the temple. So I just want to make a quick historical note there on verse 32. Then I want to flip over and take you to 55, and this is the last verse I'm going to do, then I'm just going to tell you some stories. In verse 55, here's the point of the temple. And as I read verse 55, I would encourage you to think of your experience in the temple and see if this verse kind of highlights the experience we have today in our temples. And again, verily I say unto you, I command you again to build a house to my name, even in this place, meaning Nauvoo, of course. And here's the purpose. This is why I'm making the commandment, that you may prove yourselves unto me that you are faithful in all things, whatsoever I command you, that I may bless you and crown you with honor, immortality, and eternal life. What a great summary of everything that happens inside a temple. Okay, so October 1840, it's a general conference of the church. The first one being held in Nauvoo. Joseph gathers everybody together. They're going through the conference session, speakers, singing, praying, and then Joseph starts to talk about building the temple. The saints get excited. As I open this video talking about maybe we can understand a little bit of their excitement because we had been without a temple for a long time. And saints around the world still are without a temple due to COVID restrictions and whatnot. And so the excitement level must have been off the charts. It was within days that they started to excavate the land where the temple was going to be built. They quickly found a stone quarry just a little bit outside of town. And so they started to get to work right away. In that stone quarry was limestone. They would harvest out of it big chunks, 4 to 6 feet long, these limestone blocks. They'd haul them up the hill to the temple lot. They'd drop them there, and then the stonemasons would get to work in carving them out to be perfectly smooth and squared and of the right size so they could piece it all together, miraculously piece it all together into a full-size temple. Well, this is the work that would go on. Joseph, he had William Weeks as the chief architect. He was the one in charge. Now, if you haven't been to Nauvoo since Memorial Day-ish 2021, then you have not gone through the William Weeks home, because that's when Elder Cook dedicated it just a few months ago. And so in Nauvoo, they now tell the story of William Weeks. You get a tour through his home, a reconstructed home of his, and learn about how the temple was built and some of his history and some of his story. So William Weeks is doing the job on it. Everybody is tithing their time and their efforts. 1 day in 10 is spent committed and devoted to the building of the temple. So every 10th day, you'd go to the stone quarry, pull out the rock, or you'd move it up the hill, or you'd work with the stonemasons who were working more full-time on it. In addition to stone, they also needed lumber. They needed lumber to build the inside of the temple. The lumber that they needed and the quantity of it, they needed to go over to Wisconsin to get it. Fortunately, the Mississippi River can be seen from the temple lot, and so the men got a big old barge. They headed up to Wisconsin. They filled that barge full of lumber and then sailed it all the way back down to Nauvoo. The Mississippi River moves really slow. So that barge full of timber was coming to Nauvoo really slowly. So the men had a couple of options. They could sit and on the raft and watch the cities and towns on the banks of the river go by, or they could just get to work. And they were so anxious for this temple that transporting the lumber just wasn't good enough for them. So they would spend all day on that raft, on that barge, chopping up the wood, getting it ready, so that when that barge pulled into Nauvoo, everything was ready to go. It's like making a run to Home Depot and coming back with lumber ready to put inside the temple. So the men had it all together and ready to roll as soon as they arrived there. So the temple is finally constructed. They dedicate the temple in phases. The Lord gave permission. We got the baptismal font in place. Let's dedicate it. Let's start using it. Okay, we've now got the attic rooms that are prepared enough, sufficiently, let's dedicate it and let's start doing endowment ceremonies and marriage sealings up there. And then the larger rooms that were taking more time, those 2, 3, and 4 floor levels in between the basement and the attic, they would take a little bit longer to get finished off, but once they did, it would get dedicated in phases. And so the Lord was able to get the work going even before the temple was finally dedicated. In fact, the temple wouldn't even be dedicated until after the martyrdom, after Joseph and Hiram had passed away. Okay, so here's a couple of the stories. So we've got the men build, and I'm going to tell you how the women contributed to the temple as well. That's coming up in a second. But we've got the men that are working on the temple out. They're hauling the stone up. They're putting it out there. They've got the stonemasons out there. They're putting it together. And Joseph had seen the Nauvoo Temple in vision. He knew exactly what at least the exterior looked like in great detail. In one of his meetings with William Weeks, he notices that the architectural designs had these windows, and you could see these round windows behind me. Well, it wasn't originally round in the architectural designs. It was a half window, half circular. So just like the top half of a circle. And Joseph says, no, that's not right. In vision, I saw the whole circle. The window has to be circular, not just half. And William Weeks says, that goes against every architectural rule in the book. Joseph, we can't support a round window for whatever reason. I'm not an architect. That's just the answer. And William explains to Joseph, look, if we're going to support round windows, and that many round windows, we need more foundational stones, or we need more temple underneath these windows. And Joseph said, okay, what does that mean? And he says, we're going to have to raise the height of the temple by 10 feet to get your round windows. Joseph, we don't need to do that. And Joseph says, no, we do, because I saw it. I saw it in vision. And so William goes back to his drawing desk. He figures out how to make it 10 feet higher so that we can support round windows. And we got the round windows, just as they're replicated today. Up near the top of the temple are these sunstones, they call them. I've just got a little replica here that sits on my desk of what those sunstones are like that sat at the top of the Nauvoo Temple, the original and the one today. And the story goes that there was a stonemason working on building one of these sandstones. And Joseph came up and was looking around, touring the temple lot as he regularly did. And the man who was working on one of these sandstones, he said almost in a light-hearted way, he said, hey, Joseph, is this the way you saw the sandstone, the sunstone in vision? And Joseph, he looks at it and he says, well, the nose is a little broad, but other than that, you've got it pretty good. Kind of a humorous story there, but there it is, that broad nose, one of them. Joseph says, yeah, that nose is a little broad, but it's close enough. That'll do. Now, I told you that there was a lot of men, the men were working on the temple, but it wasn't just the men. It was also the women. I want to tell you the story about Sarah Granger Kimball. And Sarah Granger Kimball, before I get you into her history, I want to make a brief mention about her father's history. Now, her father, Oliver Granger, he was a member of the church. He and his wife and his family, which included Sarah, were living in Kirtland. The saints went to Far West. Joseph because of revelation, sent Oliver Granger back to Kirtland to finalize some business deals and to sell some property and do what he could to kind of tie up the loose ends of having the ones that were left behind when the church left. And in section 117, Oliver Granger gets that commandment, and it says this, and again I say unto you, I remember my servant Oliver Granger. Behold, verily I say unto him that his name, because of going back to Kirtland and doing this work for the Lord, his name shall be had in sacred remembrance from generation to generation, forever and ever, saith the Lord. Now my question to you is, have you ever heard of Oliver Granger? Maybe you have. He's not one of those who's who of early church history. We've barely heard of him, and for those who might have heard of his name, we probably know very little of him. And yet the Lord says that his name shall be had in sacred remembrance from generation to generation, forever and ever, saith the Lord. Was the Lord wrong? Did Oliver Granger not live up to expectations? Both questions have the same answer. No, the Lord was not wrong. And no, Oliver didn't fail in his responsibilities. And yet, none of us know who Oliver Granger is. I would suggest, my opinion, that the promise given to Oliver that his name shall be held in sacred remembrance from generation to generation is fulfilled in his daughter, Sarah Granger Kimball. Because of what Sarah did, that Granger name is held in sacred remembrance today, so many generations since Oliver Granger. That's my opinion. Now, how do I form my opinion that that promise was fulfilled, or the blessing, that promise from the Lord was fulfilled through his daughter? Well, let me tell you her story, and you can come to your own conclusion. There's a book called Daughters in My Kingdom, The History and Work of Relief Society. You can find it on your Gospel Library app underneath the church history section. And I'll just have her, I'll read you her words that come from that book, or as they're recorded in that book. She says, Sarah Granger Kimball, daughter of Oliver. The Nauvoo Temple walls were about 3 feet high. Strong appeals were being made by the president of the church and others for help to forward the work. Miss Margaret Cook, one day in conversation with me on the subject of a recent appeal for provisions, clothing, bedding, and general supplies for the workmen and their families, remarked that she would be pleased to contribute needlework if it could be made available. So Joseph says, we need everybody's help. We all got to be in on this thing. And so do what you can to support the work of the temple. And so this Margaret Cook and Sarah Granger Kimball get together and they start to gather up provisions, clothing, bedding, general supplies for the workmen and their families. And Miss Cook says, you know what, give me a needle and thread and let me make more of that stuff that we can donate. So then back to Sarah Granger Kimball's quote. I offered material for her to make up and suggested that others might feel as we did. So, hey, Sister Cook, maybe there's other ladies who feel the same way, that just want to do something for the workmen and their families. We then discussed the subject of organizing a sewing society, the object of which should be to aid in the erection of the temple. About a dozen of the neighboring sisters, by invitation, met in my home the following Thursday. And then there's a side note, but also quoting from this book. So it's not Sarah's words, but the book narrates this. In that era, it was a popular practice for women to form their own organizations, often with constitutions and bylaws, set of rules to govern the organizations. The women who met at Sarah Kimball's home decided to establish a constitution and bylaws, and Eliza R. Snow accepted the responsibility to write them. Then the women asked Joseph Smith to review them and give his opinion of them. After the prophet read them, he said they were the best he had ever seen. But, he said, this is not what you want. Tell the sisters their offering is accepted of the Lord, and he has something better for them than a written constitution. I invite them all to meet with me and a few of the brethren next Thursday afternoon, and I will organize the women under the priesthood after the pattern of the priesthood. And what would that organization be? The Relief Society. It was Sarah Granger Kimball who started with the idea, let's get a dozen or so of us women together. And without an assignment given, without a church calling being extended, they just saw a need and decided how to bring relief to that need. The Relief Society. And so this is where the Relief Society, the formal organization, would begin. Now you know that it was organized in the upstairs room of the red brick store. Yeah, that happened on that Thursday afternoon that Joseph invited all these women to come and attend. Emma Smith, the wife of the prophet, would be first president of the officially organized Relief Society. But it was Sarah Granger Kimball who got the ball rolling, simply by seeing a need and figuring out how to fulfill it. she ministered. And for that, I think she stands in fulfillment of the promise given to Oliver Granger. Perhaps in section 117, the Lord was referring not to Oliver, but to his daughter, whose name would be held in sacred remembrance from generation to generation, forever and ever. And you think of our church's Relief Society organization, the largest women's organization in the entire world. And we could talk about what they do on a grand worldwide scale. But think for a minute in your own ward and branch, how the Relief Society has blessed your life, or how you've seen it bless the lives of others, or through your Relief Society association, you've been able to bless the life of someone else. Generation to generation, forever and ever, the Lord will bless and take care of because of Sarah Granger Kimball getting it started. I'll tell you another story about somebody who participated in the work of the temple, and that's a man by the name of Charles Lambert. And his story is interesting because it intertwines several people. It intertwines a lady by the name of Mary Alice Cannon. She's the younger sibling, the younger sister of George Cucanan. It also involves another family by the name of Scoville. And if you've ever been to Nauvoo, you certainly have been to the Scoville Bakery. Lucius and Lucy Scoville, they're in this story as well. So Charles Lambert, he was living in England. He heard about the gospel. He was converted. He joined the church and got on a boat and sailed to America. Before he left for America, even before he met the missionaries, he had a talent, a skill. He was a master at that skill, and that was stonemasonry. He could carve stone and build stone buildings like no one else. And here he comes to Nauvoo. He arrives in Nauvoo. He meets the prophet Joseph, his brother Hiram. He hears about the building of the temple. He hands them his credentials. He came with his resume of master craftsmen that were back in England who wrote us certificates saying, yeah, Charles Lambert, he knows what he's doing with stone. And he presents that to Joseph and Hiram. And Joseph and Hiram says, yeah, I think we want you up at the temple lot working full time. We need you, Charles. And so take your talents and your skills and go work with William Weeks and help us build a temple. We're anxious, Charles, to have this temple built. We want you doing it full time. Oh, but Charles, there's one problem. The church doesn't have much money, so although we need you employed full time, we can't pay you. We're asking you to dedicate everything to the building of the temple. And Charles says, yes, I will. I'll do it. And he promised, and he did. Well, there's a family, the Cannon family. George Cucanan, most famous one of the group, but he's a teenage boy at this time. His little sister Mary Alice, his father George, and his mother is there, of course, and other siblings, several other siblings. They're in England. They hear about the gospel. They get baptized. They also get on a boat and they head to America to join up with the saints who are now in Nauvoo. On the way across the Atlantic Ocean, Mary Alice's mother, George Cucanan's mother, passes away. She has a burial at sea. The father, George Cannon, he takes all of his children into Nauvoo. They're, of course, still active members of the church. He establishes the best life he can provide as a single father who's heavily involved in church service and trying to provide temporal financial means to give to his young children to help put food on the table. George Cannon's a really busy father. George Cannon has as a side note, he's got a skill in carpentry, and it was George Cannon who went out to Carthage with wood, lumber, and created the coffins that Hiram and Joseph would be transported in back to Nauvoo. But, excuse me, let's get back to Charles Lambert, the Scovilles, and Mary Alice. George Cannon, the father of George Q, the father of this family, he was on a business trip in St. Louis. He passes away, never makes it back to Nauvoo, and now all these Cannon children are now orphans. Mary Alice is the oldest daughter not the oldest sibling, but the oldest daughter. And so she takes upon herself, perhaps, either way, she now has the responsibility of her 3 younger siblings, who range in age all the way down to little tiny toddler. At age 16, she's orphaned, now responsible for 3 little children. It wasn't too long after that the friend of the family, Charles Lambert, proposed marriage to Mary. And Mary says, "Oh, I would love to marry you, but I've got these 3 children, and I cannot abandon. I can't go start a life with you, and what would happen to the children?" And Charles said, "Mary, what do you mean? You're bringing them with you, and I'm going to help raise them and provide for them." And Mary said, "As long as you'll take all of us, then yes, I will marry you." And so they were married. Mary and Charles are now raising these 3 little children, Mary's younger siblings. And remember, a minute or two ago, I told you that the work on the temple is not paying any money. So Charles and Mary have a house full of kids, and they themselves, everybody's hungry. Now, set that story aside. And I want to tell you another story. And then I'm going to bring them both together. Lucius, that's his name, Lucius, and Lucy Scoville. They're bakers. That's why you go to Nauvoo and you visit the Scoville bakery. And they're having hard financial troubles themselves. But despite those trials, the greater trial was the death of their 14-year-old son, Joel. Joel Scoville dies at the age of 14. They're heartbroken. What a tragedy. Joel today is buried in the Nauvoo Cemetery, a couple of miles out of town. And here behind me now is this headstone. This is where Joel was buried. Well, Lucius and Lucy are heartbroken. They bury their son here in the Nauvoo Cemetery, and because of their poverty, they can't place a headstone on the grave. And so with the heartbreak that they are suffering with of losing their son, now their heart's just being torn and twisted even more so that they can't even memorialize their son with even a simple headstone. So Joel would be buried without the headstone, and there he'd rest for quite some time without a headstone. Now our 2 stories are going to come together. So Charles Lambert, he goes home one day, and he meets Alice, Mary Alice, all distraught, in tears, very emotional. And from his journal comes the rest of the story. Charles says, "I must mention a circumstance that took place a short time previous to finishing the temple. I was going home when my wife met me at the door and began crying, saying she could stand anything but this hearing the children crying for bread, and she had none to give them. I replied, 'Why do you not go and ask the Lord to send you some?' We went into our bedroom and there made our request." In about an hour after the prayer, Brother Lucius Scoville came, and after some little talk said he would like me to make a gravestone to mark the place where his son was buried. Charles Lambert, the great stonemason. Scoville says, "I need some stone carved out." Scribed his name, date of birth, death date. Charles Lambert's the man to do it. So Scoville goes and makes the request, "Will you make a headstone for my son?" I told him I would do it. He said he was in no hurry, but he did want it done. I told him I had a family depending on me. He said he did not have anything to pay with. But in a while, through the conversation, Lucius Scoville told me that he could let me have some wheat if I wished it. I told him I would be pleased to get some. He wished me to go with him, and he would let me have it. I went, got the wheat, 4 or 4.5 bushels. I got it, took it to the mill, and returned home with the flour. Thus our prayers were answered. We've got the Lamberts, suffering, hungry, but with a skill of carving stone. We've got the Scovilles, poor, but with enough food, but poor enough that they can't have a stone carved for their son. both families praying for different things. And yet the Lord brought them together to answer both of their prayers simultaneously. Now, could the Lord have just dropped from heaven a bag of flour on the Lambert's front porch? Of course he could have. Could he have found some way to place a beautiful stone that could have been used as a marker? Yeah, probably. Of course he could. But what did the Lord do instead? He did something better. He put the two families together and said, hey, you've got flour, I've got a skill, you need my skill, I need your flour. Let's work together and solve these problems. And did you catch in the story that when Charles went home and found Mary Alice distraught and in this dire situation, he simply replied, why don't we ask the Lord to fix this for us? And immediately they went into their room, they knelt down, they prayed, Lord, we're hungry, please send something. And then, what I was wondering if you caught is the next line, in about an hour, Brother Scoville arrived. Within an hour, that prayer was answered. The temple gets constructed, it's built, it's dedicated. The saints knew that their time in Nauvoo was short. They had to get out of town. In fact, many of the saints had left before the final dedication. Remember, there were multiple dedications. Dedicate the temple, or the baptismal font, then this room, then that room. And then eventually the temple in its entire structure would be dedicated. That dedication would come in May. The saints started leaving Nauvoo in February. See, a bunch of the saints, including Brigham Young, were gone before the temple in its entirety was dedicated. And so they knew that their time with temple access was incredibly limited. And they were anxious to get their work done. This comes from the journal of Sarah P. Rich, my wife's ancestor. She says, Mr. Rich and myself were to be there at 7 in the morning, meaning at the temple, and remain until work was done at 10 o'clock or 12 o'clock at night, if necessary. Many were the blessings we had received in the house of the Lord. So Sarah and her apostle husband, Charles C. Rich, they worked hour after hour after hour, day after day, through the nights, getting as many people their temple ordinances before they had to step across the Mississippi River, not knowing when, if ever, they'd have a temple again. Brigham Young worked the same way, tirelessly through the night. His journal records that he was often in the temple 7 in the morning until 3 in the morning, just taking a 4-hour break to get something to eat and sleep a little bit and conduct all the affairs of the church and get the saints out of town. But that's what Brigham Young was doing. Brigham Young, in his journal, he records that he left the temple in what he thought was the last time. He came into the main area of the temple. He came from the downstairs area, he came from the upstairs area where the ordinances were being performed, down into the interior of the first floor, and he saw throngs of people, dozens of them, waiting to be allowed to go upstairs for their temple ordinances. And Brigham said, we're out of time. We've done all that we can do. But he promised them, he said, but the Lord will allow us to build a temple again. We'll go to the west, we'll build another temple, and you'll be able to receive your temple ordinances. And he dismissed the congregation that was there waiting for their ordinances. They all went outside, followed by Brigham. He was going to be the last out, kind of turn the lights off, and if there were light switches, we'd blow out the candles, I suppose, and lock the door behind him. And when he left the temple and went to close the door behind him, he locked it, and he turned around and looked out in front of the temple. And all of those people who had once been in the foyer area of the temple were now standing in front of the temple, without a word, but just with hope and pleading in their eyes. Brigham, he must have taken a deep breath and said, okay. He unlocked the door. He opened it up and said, let's go. Inside. Come upstairs. Let's seal you. Let's endow you. And get you fully prepared to head across the plains. And they did. They came back in. Brigham delayed his departure from Nauvoo by 2 weeks. spending those next 14 days taking care of all those people who literally refused to go out onto the plains and walk, not knowing when a temple would be available to them again. They refused to do that before receiving their temple ordinances. Sarah P. Rich says that it's in her journal that 5,615 people received their temple ordinances prior to leaving Nauvoo. Now think of it, it's a town of 12,000, 12 to 15,000. So a third? Well, what about the children who aren't old enough to receive endowments and things like that? That's a pretty high ratio of endowed members of the church. As many saints that could be endowed were. But then the saints had to leave Nauvoo. And Wilford Woodruff, he was one of the last people to leave Nauvoo. I was in Nauvoo on the 26th day of May, 1846 for the last time, and left the city of the saints, feeling that most likely I was taking a final farewell of Nauvoo for this life. I looked upon the temple and the city as they receded from view and asked the Lord to remember the sacrifices of his saints. Shortly after all the saints had left Nauvoo, an arson would come into the temple and destroy it by fire, leaving just one, the western wall, I believe the western wall, intact, the rest of it in crumbles, until a tornado finally came and finished off the job, destroying the temple in its entirety. And there it would sit for quite some time until 1937, when the church would purchase the original temple lot. And from 1937 until about 2000, saints would visit Nauvoo, go to the temple lot, and be able to visit that sacred location. But then, in the April 1999 General Conference, President Hinckley announced, "In closing now, I feel impressed to announce that among all the temples we are constructing, we plan to rebuild the Nauvoo Temple. A member of the church and his family have provided a very substantial contribution to make this possible. We are grateful to them. It'll be a while before it happens, but the architects have begun their work. This temple will not be busy much of the time. It will be somewhat isolated, but during the summer months we anticipate it will be very busy, and the new building will stand as a memorial to those who built the first such structure there on the banks of the Mississippi." In 2002, 3 years later, President Hinckley went out to Nauvoo and he dedicated the Nauvoo Temple. He dedicated it on June 27th, 2002. Why June 27th? Because that was the anniversary of the martyrdom of Joseph and Hyrum, who died on June 27th, 1844. Dedicatory services began promptly at 5:17 p.m. What an odd time to begin the service. But it began at 5:17 because John Taylor, who was in Carthage jail that fateful day with the prophet and Joseph, and also with Willard Richards, who survived, he had a pocket watch. And his pocket watch got smashed in the commotion of the martyrdom in that scene. And it was crushed. When it was crushed, it stopped working. And it stopped working at 5:17. So whether the chaotic scenes of the martyrdom began or ended at 5:17, it happened at near that time at least. And so President Hinckley began the dedicatory services on June 27th, promptly at 5:17 p.m., the exact anniversary. Now the Nauvoo Temple, as I've been told, is as close to a perfect replica of the original Nauvoo Temple that could be even fathomed. There's a reason behind that. And it started a long time ago, the reasoning, and the why the temple today looks so much just as it did. William Weeks followed the saints. Remember, he was the architect. He was the man in charge of building the temple. He went with the saints to Salt Lake. Soon after arriving in Salt Lake, he became disassociated with the church. He became inactive. He ended up out in California or somewhere. But he kept the original architectural plans, the blueprints of the temple with him, kind of as a souvenir, I guess. And he kept those and he gifted them to his daughter. His daughter kept them at her house, sitting in a dusty closet somewhere for many years until she cleaned out the house and found the temple architectural designs and gave them to her son. And her son did the same thing. He lived in a little obscure town of Barron, California, in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of the Mojave Desert. And back in 1948, a couple of missionaries knocked on his door. And he says, "No, I'm not interested in your message." But the missionaries built a relationship with that family despite their interest in the church, for whatever reason, not known at the time. But because of that relationship that these missionaries had with that family, with the grandson of William Weeks, this grandson, whose name was, I think of Lucille Griffins, was the last name. So Mr. Griffins had this relationship with these missionaries to the point where he felt comfortable. In fact, he probably felt prompted to go and find that box, dust it off, pull out the original architectural designs that his grandfather had drafted, and he gave them to the missionaries. One of those missionaries was set to go home in the next 2 or 3 weeks. And when he went home, he very quickly contacted the church and delivered those architectural designs to the church historian. And they probably got put in church archives somewhere, and they sat there from 1948 until 1999, when it was decided that they would rebuild the Nauvoo Temple. And they wanted to get it to look just the right way, to have it just as it was at one time, including those full circular windows. Well, they went to the church archives, they pulled them out. Here's the original architectural designs. What a miracle. If you go to the church's website under the church history section, you'll find this story. And a quote from that story I'll read to you. Years later, these same drawings, so years after the missionaries had been gifted the architectural designs, years later, these same drawings were instrumental in rebuilding the Nauvoo Temple. Bishop Keith B. McMullen, then a member of the presiding bishopric, said, "Efforts have been made to reflect as closely as practical the original exterior designs and interior appointments. Brother Weeks' drawings were an essential part of this study and research. The manner in which the Nauvoo Temple has been reconstructed would not have been possible without these original plans." And like so many stories from church history, we see the hands of the Lord guiding his work all along the way. It may have taken from 1846 to 2002 to get the temple built the way the Lord wanted it built, but all along the way there's a certain chain of events that lined up just perfectly, just at the right time, so we can have the Nauvoo Temple reconstructed and available to church members to attend today, where they, like the saints of the 1840s, can participate in such sacred, wonderful ordinances and be reminded of the blessings found in section 124, verse 55. "Come to the temple so that I may bless you and crown you with honor, immortality, and eternal life." The Nauvoo Temple was that, it is that, and every and each temple dedicated throughout the world provides those same blessings and opportunities. Is it no wonder that President Nelson is so anxious for us to participate in those temple ordinances, as he says, as often as circumstances permit? Make time for the Lord in attending the temple is President Nelson's continual plea, as it was most recently in this last General Conference. It's also my testimony that these things found in the temple are true. I've enjoyed sharing these stories with you today. That's section 124. Enjoy your doctrinal study of it, and I'll look forward to telling you more stories from Nauvoo. There's hundreds and hundreds of stories from the Nauvoo period of great people like the Lamberts, the Canyons, the Scovilles, the Weeks, and the others that I've told you about today. And for the next few weeks while we're in the Nauvoo period, I'm looking forward and anxious to share with you as many of those stories as I can. But until then, have a wonderful week. Enjoy section 124, and I'll look forward to visiting with you next time. I forgot to remind you, now I'm going to show you that video of the women's garden that's located in Nauvoo.